we are less than 2 months away from the 2012 elections. Joining me right now to talk about the campaign season and expectations going into the elections, we have Dr. Larry Jacobs from the Humphrey Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you again.
So, Dr. Jacobs, let's begin with this particular election cycle. Minnesotans will elect a president, a U.S. senator, and members of Congress and state legislators. So, in your opinion, do you think people are going to go in and research the candidates and the issues prior to getting into the election booth? Or do you think that essentially whoever they vote for president will dictate the party of votes down the line?
It's going to vary. You're going to have some people, perhaps 3/4 or so, who are just going to do a party line vote. We've got a whole bunch of Hatfield and McCoys out here who are Democrats and Republicans, and they just vote straight ticket. So the big question that rises is who's going to turn out and vote.
Is that still the case, or do you find that that's diminishing a bit with?
We have seen evidence that the straight ticket voting has increased over time as polarization has increased both in our state capitals but also in Washington. We're seeing voters not quite as polarized as what we're seeing in our elected officials, but they're more polarized.
Let's talk about the 2 constitutional amendments that are on the ballot. How do you think they're going to impact voter turnout and perhaps even election results?
Very interesting. You know, you look at the way the election's playing out, and at this point, it looks as if Mitt Romney is not going to be making a major investment in time or money in Minnesota. At this point, the polls show the Democratic incumbent U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar far ahead of her challenger. And if that continues, it may diminish some of the motivation for Republicans to turn out and vote, accept the constitutional amendments. Particularly the same-sex marriage constitutional amendment may mobilize some of those more conservative or Republican-leaning voters to turn out and cast their ballots. So those amendments could be quite important.
74% of constitutional amendments since 1974 have been approved by voters. So given the polling, what do you think the outcome of each amendment would be? Do you care to speculate?
You know, my sense at this point is that both amendments will pass. We've got the historic record, which is overwhelmingly that the amendments do carry. And then we've got polling data on each amendment, which generally shows support for how they're being presented in the actual amendment language.
Dr. Jacobs, Minnesota historically has a very high percentage of voter turnout. So given what we see on the ticket this year, do you expect the same?
I do expect very high turnout. I think it's going to matter, though, who turns out. In 2010, we saw pretty good turnout, but there was a drop-off in turnout among more Democratic or Democratic-leaning voters. And the result was that the legislature shifted into the Republican column, both the House and the Senate. And what was interesting is, this is very important, the majorities rest on very small numbers. For instance, in the House, the majorities won in 2010 are based on about 600 votes. So it doesn't take a whole lot of change in terms of who turns out, and particularly if there would be a drop-off in Republican turnout, to have a major impact on those legislative races. I think turnout will be high, but I do think there's a chance that the turnout among Republicans might dip a bit, particularly if presidential candidate Mitt Romney doesn't invest in Minnesota and Amy Klobuchar goes on to a pretty significant win.
You've been doing this for a really long time. I'd like to get a sense of what you think, how you would categorize and encapsulate this particular election cycle. Do you think we're at a crossroads? Do you think this is one of the most important elections in this generation?
You know, almost every election you come around to, and you can see why it's important. And this is an important election. I do think the issues that are being framed and the very significant differences between the parties presents a bit of a crossroads. Whichever party is elected, they've got a very clear path that they're going to take the country in, and they're pretty different. So it is a significant election, and I think it'll be one of those elections that could well be thought back on as a crossroads. Here in Minnesota, on the national level, for instance, health reform is very much in the balance. One party says full steam ahead for implementing health reform after the Supreme Court's ruling upholding it. Another party said, let's repeal it. Those are pretty big differences.
What do you think the undecided voter should look for between now and November?
Well, we're going to spend a lot of money, perhaps over $1 billion, maybe quite a bit more than $1 billion in advertising. both party organizations and campaigns are going to put a lot of money into reaching out to voters, and the truth is a lot of that is targeted on a very small number of folks who are genuinely undecided. I think the key issue for undecided voters is to pay attention. As a generalization, the undecided voters tend to be less interested in politics and less knowledgeable. And I think this is one of those years where you want to kind of sit up and see if you can figure out where the candidates stand. Not what your impression is, but where their position really is on some of these big issues related to taxing and spending and health reform and the direction of our foreign policy.
Have you ever seen anything quite like this with all of the different tentacles that are out there, particularly statewide with the amendments and as many seats that are up for grabs as are?
There's a lot at stake in this election. I think there's no doubt that we've got some big choices in front of us. But I'm not sensing at this point what I would describe as a wave election. If you think back over the last few election cycles, 2006 and 2008 were wave elections that went in the Democrats' favor. The 2010 election was a wave election that went in the favor of Republicans, and we saw Republicans in Minnesota, for instance, win the Minnesota Senate for the first time in decades, along with picking up the House. I don't see that as likely this time around. It seems as if voters are more mixed. It's going to be a very close national race for the presidency. Minnesota, I think, will have some close legislative races as well, and congressional races. So it seems more that the candidates and the issues they stand on could be more important this year than what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 cycles.
Dr. Larry Jacobs, we are out of time, but it'll be fascinating to get you back after the elections and we can talk about some of the results and the trends.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.